Hi, I'm Peter Rowlett.
And I'm Katie Steckles. And Peter, what's today's mathematical object?
Well, I have brought a game. Always good to bring a game. This is a Noughts and Crosses style game, or tic-tac-toe if you prefer. But it's advertised on the box as Noughts and Crosses with a novel twist. So this is a game from 1970.
Yeah, it does look like one.
It does.
It's a very battered old box.
Yes, absolutely. And it's a very nice, I just love the advertising of it. It's got a picture of the board with the blocks on it and a hand holding one of the blocks. It's easy. It's 1970, so it's pre the era where boxes always came with a grinning child on the front. It's just, here is the game. Please play this game. Yeah, and it's. I found out about it because Maths Jam is a monthly Puzzles in the Pub night and has an annual conference. And following along on Twitter with Maths Jam, I saw somebody had found this in a charity shop and was playing it. And so, I looked online and I managed to pick up a copy pretty cheap. The point of it is you get a box, which is the standard Noughts and Crosses 3x3 grid, and you get 9 dice, I guess. Whatever pieces, yeah. Whatever you would call them. These are interesting because they have noughts on 2 faces, crosses on 2 faces, and the other 2 faces are blank. And between the 2 blank faces is actually hollow. You can actually put something through this die.
Yeah, it's like a cube with the middle section taken out.
Yes. And the idea of the game is you roll this die, and if, say I'm crosses and you're noughts, if I roll this, come up blank, which isn't very good at the start of the game. Now it's come up naught, so even though I'm crosses, I still have to play the naught on the board.
Right.
And that benefits you, of course. So in that case, it's interesting. So if you get your own shape, you play it. If you get the other person's shape, you play it. If you get a blank, you can remove one from the board.
Right.
Which is why that isn't interesting at the start of the game, because there was nothing on the board yet. But it's quite curious because you're sort of playing 2 games at once, because there is a Noughts and Crosses standard is that you put on the grid and the first person to get 3 in a row wins. You can perfectly well play a sensible Noughts and Crosses variant where you're playing to lose, where you're playing that the first person to get 3 in a row is the one who loses.
Yeah. And
that's quite a different strategy. And in this game, you're sort of playing both at once.
Yeah, because you might be playing for the other person. So.
Yeah, so that kind of interests me. It also... So combinatorial... Well, Noughts and Crosses is a solved game, so it's sort of not interesting.
Yeah.
In a sense.
Yeah, it's kind of small enough that you can just check all the possible combinations and work out optimal strategies.
And if both players play perfectly, it's a draw,
yeah.
And that'll happen if you've played it enough, basically. So it's interesting to have a twist on Noughts and Crosses. One thing I notice is there are a bunch of assumptions you need for a combinatorial game, sort of that it's 2-player and turn-based, and both players have perfect information about the game, so everybody knows what's happening at all times, and blah blah. And 2 of them, one of them is that there's no chance involved, which this breaks because it's random.
There's literally dice.
Yep.
Yeah.
And the other is that the game has to be finite, and this is not finite.
Yeah, because I guess you could keep rolling a blank and taking one off, and then rolling a thing and putting one on.
Yep.
Yeah.
We could just keep rolling blanks forever, and the game would never end. So what that means is you can't do the standard thing you would do in Noughts and Crosses, which is to draw a game tree of all the possible options, because that you can't enumerate all the possible options because it goes on forever. So that I think is interesting. So it's sort of it's not quite a combinatorial game, but it is it's taking a solved game and giving it a couple of twists that just make it that little bit more interesting, I think. And particularly what's interesting is that you're not alternating turns. So a lot of the strategies you have for Noughts and Crosses are based on, if I can set it up so that there's 2 ways I could win and the other person can only block one of them, then I'm definitely going to win. But you don't know that because you might not be the next person to play.
Yeah, you might just get 9 crosses in a row and fill up the board with crosses.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting because you sort of also assume when you're playing a game like this that the 2 players are playing optimally. But in some sense they're not, because every so often a nought that's placed might have been placed by the other person, so it will obviously be the least optimal possible move.
Yeah, so just then when I rolled a nought, if that was the first move of the game, if it was my piece, I'd put it in the corner or the middle. But because it's your piece, I would put it in the middle of a side, because I want you to be least advantaged by me playing that piece.
Yeah.
So then one thing that interests me is this weird shape of the die, and the fact that it's it's not got any substance in the middle of it and on two of the faces.
Yeah, it kind of makes me wonder, because like one of the main properties of a dice is that it should be fair. I mean, I guess in the context of the game, it doesn't necessarily have to be, because I guess it's fair between noughts and crosses.
Yes.
Like there's an equal chance of a nought or a cross, and it might be that it's slightly different chance of a blank.
Yeah.
But yeah.
For the purposes of people playing along at home, I would like to know whether this is a fair die, because I want to know whether you can just play it with a normal die without having to buy a copy off the internet.
Yeah, I don't think this is currently still made.
No,
like,
I don't
all the
think
versions I've seen have been second-hand online in
Yeah.
these adorable, battered old 1970s boxes.
And it's copyright 1970 Invicta Plastics Limited of Leicester. And so I wonder if it's I wonder if it's offcuts from some plastic process, or whether it's showing off, look, we can make these fancy plastic. But why are a plastic company making this game? I mean, maybe they want to make some money on it. I just don't know the motivation.
Maybe they have a staff member that's really into combinatorial games
Yeah,
and just wanted to do something fun. Yeah.
Anyway, so I did the natural thing that actually I want to know whether this is a fair die or not. And I said this to some students, and I said, well, so of course I sat in front of the telly one evening and rolled one of them 501 times. And for some reason, my students thought this was an unusual thing to do. You know?
Can't understand that. I mean, I would think it's slightly unusual in that I would just roll all of them 1/9 as many times.
Yeah,
I'd just grab the whole bundle and chuck them all down at the same time.
I don't know if they would interact with each other. Yeah, difficult.
Yeah, dice.
So I rolled them 501 times. I got 161 noughts, 159 crosses, and 181 blanks.
Interesting.
Now these are similar numbers. 2 of them around 160, 1 of them around 180. Slightly more blanks. Is that significant?
Wow.
So there are ways to find out this sort of thing, right? So I did a two-tailed binomial test, for which the null hypothesis is that the block is a fair die. So then you test whether 181 out of 501 is consistent with a probability of a third, because 2 of the 6 faces are blank, so I want to know, is that consistent with the probability of a third rolling a blank? And the p-value was 0.18 and change. So if you take your significance level to be 5% or whatever you take it as, this is a massive p-value. So we can say that that basically you can play with a regular die, pen and paper.
Right.
So if you draw yourself a noughts and crosses grid, get yourself a die, and then you have to decide what numbers. So say 1 and 2 are naught, 3 and 4 are cross, and the others are blank. Then you can play this game.
Yeah, well, I guess you can anyway, because you can just assume it's a fair die and make up your own game. You know, even if the game of Ox Blocks works in a slightly different way.
If you're going to be slapdash about it.
Yeah. So this statistical test. So I guess you're essentially just saying, if I did have a fair die, what are the chances that this particular distribution would come up? And if you can see that distribution is within the normal parameters of what you might expect to happen if you were using an actual fair die.
Yes, that's absolutely what it is. It doesn't tell you that it absolutely is even, because that's not how significance works.
Yeah.
And it is an interesting question, I think, why doesn't it affect it? Because it's sort of not a symmetrical object.
Yeah,
it
I kind of want
is.
it to be. Yeah, it's symmetrical enough, I guess, for the purposes. It reminds me of, because Matt Parker did a really nice YouTube video about the question of if you have a coin. Because obviously when you have a coin, you flip the coin, there's a 50-50 chance of each face. But there is a very tiny chance that it might land directly on its edge.
Okay. Yeah.
If it's a particularly thick coin, there's a chance it might land on its edge.
I seem to remember this being a plot point from a Terry Pratchett book.
Potentially, yeah.
I think so.
But he was essentially asking the question: how thick does the coin have to be before it's a 1/3 chance of heads, tails, or edge?
Right.
So he did this by getting a bunch of coins of different thicknesses. They're basically cylinders at this point. They're kind of weird dice.
Yeah.
But they're not really coins. But they were kind of thick coins that had different thicknesses, and he tried to do a calculation mathematically for what shape would have an equal probability, but it depends largely on how you model a dice landing and what you're claiming is necessary for this to be equal.
Right.
And using, I think, a few different methods of calculating, he got different values for each.
Okay.
So he kind of didn't know whether there was any way to attack it kind of engineering maths wise, like mechanics wise. So he just did a whole bunch of trials with all these different coins, and they did the same statistical analysis, like if this were an actual fair coin, what are the chances that this result would come up, and are they within the reasonable expectation? Yeah
That's interesting.
So I guess what we know is that you can probably get just a normal dice and have yourself a game of this if you wanted to.
Yes.
Cool. So we are both on Twitter. I'm at Steckles.
And I'm at Peter Rowlett.
And we both blog at aperiodical.com, which is where you can also find more episodes of this podcast.
And if you want to email us and suggest other objects we could be looking at or have any comments, you can email us objects@aperiodical.com.
The music is Funk Game Loop by Kevin MacLeod, licensed under Creative Commons.